Well, welcome to the MALAT podcast. My name is Jean-Pierre, and we've got Jonathan on the other side there.
Hello, everyone.
And so today we're going to talk about whether or not digital natives learn differently. And it's in order to understand the argument, we do have some terms to define first. The first of all is just what a digital native is. And so a digital native is someone who was born roughly between 1977 and 1997. Some terms that also get used are millennials or the net generation, and they're used or they're viewed as those who grew up with and have a high level of skill in technology. So they have a natural aptitude for it as a result of growing up with that. The opposite is the digital immigrant, and that's obviously somebody who's born before that time, so before 77, and they're viewed as not having the same fluency, but um, they also have they can either be averse to technology or they can have uh, a leaning towards more analog things like pen and paper books, as opposed to computers and Kindle, that sort of thing. And then final term to define is essentially learning. So in context of the debate, learning is going to be taken to mean the acquisition of knowledge. So what you know now that you didn't know before. Digital natives are described as learning in a nonlinear fashion. So they can multitask and they can learn from multiple sources. They don't have to be focused on one thing and then finish that, move on to the next. Whereas digital immigrants do tend towards being a more linear in their learning habits. So they literally do focus on one thing and then move on to the next.
So you were born in 79 and I was born in 83. So that makes
Yep.
us the digital generation.
Yep. Exactly.
So do digital natives learn differently? Do we learn differently? And to answer that question, there's essentially a couple of underpinning questions to analyze. Is there truly a divide between these groups? And if so, does education need to conform to such learning preferences?
Right. And so the first thing to think of when we're looking at that, then, as far as the argument is concerned, is technology skills. So because digital natives have used technology all their lives, um, they should, according to the theory, be able to navigate content faster, be able to apply it to learning, and acquire knowledge faster. So um, when it comes to technological competency, they should be able to surf the web, navigate operating systems, fuel. Fuel the rate that they acquire knowledge, that side of things, and then develop critical thinking skills as a result. Now, the research at the same time, um, there's little scientific evidence that agrees with this. So, for instance, the primary uses are not in developing content; it's more in just surfing the web, using email, word processing. Whereas, about 21 to 24%, depending on what study you're reading, are actually actively creating things using technology. And so there's also a concept of or concept the idea of socioeconomic background. And when uh, s- when someone has one background, they might have access to it or have grown up with it, but a large portion doesn't seem to have grown up with that, and so they're not there's not really this idea of a universal native group. The generalization is uh, it is exactly that. It's a generalization. It's not. Uh, it all comes down to socioeconomics and a lot to do with personal preference, and where you're using things in jobs and that sort of things.
Right. So if you and I grew up with technology and we had access to the internet and we had video games and whatnot, it doesn't mean that the people that down the street are necessarily using that technology.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily mean even if we have that access that we're do you feel like you and me, do we feel like we need to be using technology to learn everything? I personally don't.
I don't either. Yeah.
I
Like
don't feel like
for
it's important.
myself, yeah. If we're just talking about ourselves, I prefer in a lot of instances, I prefer just doing things on pen and paper. Um, but it all depends on the circumstance and what you're trying to accomplish, right?
Exactly. So the second claim to look at in this debate is essentially that digital natives have developed specific learning preferences due to their upbringing with the technology. So the primary example of this is learning preferences is the concept of multitasking. So if I was taking myself back to my undergrad and I put myself in a lecture hall, in my case it was biology, science, science major, and I set up my laptop. So in this view, I set up my laptop. Let's say the lecture is an hour, and I've got Facebook open. I have Instagram open. I've got my browser open. Maybe I'm checking out the latest news, some scores in basketball, whatnot. And I've got my slide set that we're covering that lecture. So by this perspective, I'm able to do all the above and still pay attention to the lecturer, to the content. I'm in theory able to extract the meaning from that lecture. So the question is it, well, does that actually work? And for one, if you look at the empirical evidence, well, empirically, it's proven to actually inhibit learning. So multitasking does not work. If you want to learn one, if I wanted to learn that lecture material, I'm best to shut down everything else and focus my energy and my attention into that one subject. And studies actually show you take it one step further that you'll actually learn faster, right? Um, so even some claim multitaskers are actually terrible at every aspect of multitasking, which stuck to me. I find that kind of humorous, you know. Um, and the other point is the argument against is that our brains are just simply not able to multitask by theory.
Mm.
So we can put our attention on one task and then move in a linear fashion, or if you want to call it a lateral fashion, in this case with the laptop, but your attention is still on the Facebook and then it's on Instagram, then it's on the lecture and so forth. You can't actually divide your time like that. So what you're doing is segmenting your attention. Is that a benefit to learning, to your learning? According to this, not so much.
Yeah, and then with that, it also kind of leads into how does the brain work, right? So, with regard to the concept of neuroplasticity is one that gets brought up, and so the idea with that is it's the neural networks in the brain that change the growth and reorganization of just how the brain works, essentially. So, the argument goes that to acquire new skills or knowledge, you have to spend significant amount of time practicing or learning something. And so, digital natives, for example, grew up with technology. So, we would have spent a lot more time around, video games and computers and the like. And as a result, we just have a natural or ability to do this because the neural connections in the brain have been created. So the the idea is then because of that there's a learning preference that develops and that technology becomes part of that motivation to learn. Um, the and then the argument when you look at the empirical evidence though, um, you know that learning in general is it's a fundamental function of the brain. It's not something that is somehow suddenly developed because of technology. So unless it's impaired by disease or some sort of shock to the system, learning can occur at any age. There's nothing technology based that is required in order to learn. Neuroplasticity happens for everybody of all ages. It may be a little bit more difficult for someone who's older, but it is still possible to learn.
So like the debate about media and learning, that is essentially, you know, you have your preferences. So if you grow up with technology and your brain literally physiologically adapts to what you're doing, it doesn't mean that when you turn 20 or 30 or 40 or what have you, that you can't develop new preferences.
Exactly.
Okay, so do digital natives learn differently? To ask the question one more time, I feel, let's go back and forth here,
Yeah.
that no, they don't learn differently. I mean, fundamentally, we learn Essentially the same when we look at the neurology, but do we prefer to learn, using different methods? Yes.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. Like the method might be different, but the learning, the way that the learning occurs, that's linear. It is the way it is, and yeah, as far as whether we learn or learn differently, I don't think we do.
And that's that.
All right. So anyway, this has been Mallet Podcast, and again, my name is Sean Pierre, and I've got Jonathan on the other side. And if you have any questions, please feel free to let us know. But otherwise, have a good rest of your day.